Okay, we're going to do something a little bit different as far as the zooming is concerned. If you have watched me, have zoomed or watched the recording, you know there's a big chunk at the very beginning of the recording before the class actually starts, because I had it set to start recording as soon as somebody logged in. I have changed that so it will not start recording until I hit record. And so that way the recording will be better. I won't have to cut off the blank part at the beginning. But there is a danger that I will forget to press the record button. So based on what you've seen in chapter 1, how can we use economics to make sure that I don't forget to press the record button? Incentives. Okay. When you have a problem, you're looking for a solution, look for a way to create an incentive to prevent that from happening. Okay. So what I propose is I want to enlist all of you to help me. When I press the record button, I will say I have pressed the record button. Okay. And you'll know I did it. And then you can tell me if I forget. But why should you tell me if I forget? How is that going to benefit you? Well,
You're the lecturer. You're the lecturer.
Well, you're here, so you're probably not going to watch the recording. Okay? So it doesn't make all that much difference to you whether I record it or not. Okay? But for somebody who's missing the lecture, it's important that I hit the record button. So you can help me by reminding me if I forget, but you really don't have much incentive to do that. So I can think about, well, how could I create an incentive for you to raise your hand and say you forgot to press the record button? What kind of incentive could I create?
Bonus points.
I could tell you, if I don't say I press the record button and you remind me, then you get $100. Would that be a pretty effective incentive? Yes, it would. Not going to do that, because that would cost me a lot of money. It would create an incentive for me to remember, because every time I started lecturing, I would think it's going to cost me $100 if I don't press record button. But I'm not willing to potentially lose $100. So what other kind of incentive could I create? Bonus points. Okay? If I said you get 50 bonus points on the next exam, then I have no doubts that you would let me know. Okay? Not going to do that either. Okay? I'm going to give you enough of an incentive to motivate somebody to let me know if I don't say I pressed the record button. So that incentive is going to be 3 points. Okay? I forget to say I pressed the record button, and you remind me. Doesn't apply to, if 10 people tell me, only the person who tells me first will get it. Okay? But if you're the first person to say, did you press the record button? Then you will get 3 points that will be added to your next exam. Okay? If you're not sure if I said I pressed it, then ask me. And if I didn't, you get the points. If I did say it and you just didn't notice it, no cost in that. Okay? So you have nothing to lose by saying, asking if I remember to press the record button. Is any questions about that? Huh?
Is that for real or
This is anything I say is for real. That's a good question, because a lot of people say things they haven't really thought through, and I try to think very carefully about what I say before I say it, and think about what are the implications. That's why I'm not offering you $100, and I'm not offering you 50 bonus points. I'm offering enough so that you have a real incentive, but I don't think it's going to have significant effect on the overall grade distribution of the class. Okay? So I will tell you now that I have pressed the record button. All right. Let's see. And to help me remember, I have printed out a page that I put down here, press record, and also a quotation that I want to keep in my mind as I'm teaching. This is from a famous economist, F.A. Hayek, who defined the task of economics somewhat differently than probably most economists do. I think his perspective is very, very helpful. He said, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. The world is complicated. And when we say, hey, let's go and create a policy that's going to achieve a certain thing, there's a very high probability that it's going to have some effects we didn't anticipate. And economics, an important role of economics is to show us how to think through what the implications of our actions are going to be. Because if we don't think through the implications, we're likely to take actions which lead to consequences that we didn't intend and we didn't want, but we didn't anticipate it, we didn't know it was going to happen, so we got an outcome we didn't like. Anyway, today we are going to begin with chapter 2. In chapter 1, we talked about what economics is. We talked about the 10 big ideas in economics. I'd encourage you to review that list at least every couple of days, because those ideas are so important, and they are not the kind of thing that you hear them and you just got it and it's a part of you. You have to think about it over and over, and you have to look for ways to apply it to the situations that you're in. Right? Just like we applied the idea of incentives to the problem of how do we get me to remember to press the record button. Those simple ideas, if you apply them consistently to the problems you face in life, can make an incredible difference to how successful you are at achieving your goals. Chapter 2 is entitled Power of Trade and Comparative Advantage. I would say that there's a part of this chapter that you're going to think, well, that's just obvious. This is just totally simple. But it's not maybe simple, but it's something you have to consciously think about to really grasp the significance of it. Okay? So for part of it, I'll say, really think hard about it, even though it seems simple and obvious. Then toward the end of the chapter, we get to some material that I would say is some of the more difficult material, more technical things that we will cover. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on comparative advantage, but it is, in some ways, it makes sense intuitively, but in some ways, people have a lot of trouble with it. Okay? So just be prepared when we get to that. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the conclusions we get from it are really, really important. We're going to begin this chapter with asking the question, why do we trade? Why do we engage in exchanges with other people? Think about what we've already said. We've said that we all face scarcity. We don't have all of the things that we would like to have. And so we would like to be able to get as much of those things that we want as possible. And there are really two ways to get the things you want. You can produce them yourself, or you can trade with somebody else. Okay? Actually, there is a third way to get what you want. Anybody think of what that is? You can steal it. You want a hamburger. You see somebody who has a hamburger, you can hit them over the head and take their hamburger. And you know, we kind of laugh at that because you're not supposed to do that. Okay? But historically, that has been a very important way, a very common way that people have gotten what they wanted. They see somebody else who has what they want. They conclude, I'm strong enough to take it away from them. So they seize the property of other people. Or they enslave other people. And they say, you're going to produce what I want. Okay? In a civilized society, one of the first things we do is say, that's not acceptable. You can't enslave other people. You can't take their stuff. So we're not going to consider those options. We're going to be thinking in terms of a market economy that's based on private property, which means the property that belongs to you, you get to do with it what you want. You don't get to, somebody else can't come and take it away from you. Now, you can't use your property in a way that harms somebody else. You can't drive your car through my front yard. But as long as you don't break the rules, as long as you don't violate other people's rights, you're free to use your property however you want. And in that kind of economy, that kind of economic system, to get what you want, you've only got two options. You can produce it yourself, or you can trade with somebody else in order to get what you want. Let's think about that first option. If you're going to produce it yourself, you're going to try to produce everything you want yourself, then we call that being self-sufficient. Think about being self-sufficient. If you're self-sufficient, do you need other people? No, you can just, you don't have to worry about what other people do. You're able to produce what you want. Being in a certain way, being self-sufficient would simplify your life. On the other hand, if you're self-sufficient, that means you can only consume what you can produce. And that is the problem. Think about the things that you have already consumed today. Probably had breakfast, may have driven somewhere, so you used a car, you used gasoline, you're wearing a mask, you have a computer, you have clothing, you have all these things. Ask yourself, do you know how to produce all those things? The obvious answer is no. Second question, do you know how to produce any of those things? Good chance that you don't know how to produce any of the things that you have used this morning or that you will use this afternoon. Okay? So being self-sufficient creates a huge problem. It sounds great to be self-sufficient and not dependent on other people. But to do that, you have to know how to produce everything. And we don't have that knowledge. Okay? One way to say this would be that it would be great to know how to produce all those things. If somebody could, like in the Matrix, where they could just plug something into your head and you download the knowledge and you know how to do it. That would be wonderful, to know how to produce everything yourself. Okay? The problem is it's costly to learn how to produce things. If you're going to learn how to grow wheat, then you're going to have to spend a lot of time learning how to grow wheat. And if you're going to have a car, you're going to have to learn how to make a car and how to produce gasoline. Right? it's costly to produce everything that you want to consume and that I want to consume. So would it be great to know how to produce all those things just by, snapping your fingers? That would be great. But reality doesn't work that way. So does it make sense? Here's the question. Does it make sense for you to use your time in trying to become self-sufficient, trying to learn how to grow your own food, make your own clothing, build your own computer? I would suggest to you the answer is no. It has been said that the self-sufficiency is the road to poverty. Because if you're going to try to be self-sufficient, then you've got to spend part of your time learning how to grow food, part of your time learning how to make clothing. You have to produce so many things, you don't become good at any of them. And so you end up in poverty. Yes, it would be great to know how to produce everything, but does that mean that it makes sense to try to gain all of that knowledge? No, that is the road to poverty. And that's why you find very, very few people who seriously try to be self-sufficient. Our default when we want something is not to say, how can I produce this? But to say, who knows how to produce this? Who can I trade with? Who would be willing to make it for me and then produce it? And what would they be willing to accept? If you need a new computer, shouldn't say need. If you want a new computer, you don't think, oh, I'm going to have to learn how to make a computer. You think, who's willing to sell me a computer? What are they going to be willing to accept in exchange? And what can I produce so that I can get that thing that they want? Okay? So let's say you say, well, I know Best Buy sells computers. So once you conclude, yes, they have the computer I'd like to have, then you ask the question, well, what are they willing to accept? And what are they willing to accept? If you go to Best Buy and say, I'd like a computer, what can I offer you to give me a computer? What are they going to say?
Money.
Money. Okay. They're going to say, they're going to think you're kind of strange because it's obvious everybody in our country and many people around the world accept dollars. So you don't have to figure out how can I produce a computer. You simply find somebody who knows how to produce it. You figure out what are they willing to accept, how many dollars are they going to require to make the exchange with you. And then you have to figure out, okay, how do I get these dollars? Well, you get dollars by figuring out how you can exchange with other people. You have to figure out, in order to get the computer you want, you have to think about, what can I produce with the resources I have? What can I produce that somebody else would be willing to accept and would give me dollars? Okay? If you're an artist and you can produce artwork that other people value, then the most effective way for you to get your computer is for you to go home and create paintings, create artwork. Okay? And you then find somebody who can't do the painting for themselves. They offer you money so that they can get the painting they want. You get the dollars you want. Why do you want the dollars? So you can buy the computer. Okay? That's the way things work in a market economy. And that takes us to one of the most important ideas in this course and in all of economics. And it's an idea that so many people in the world today do not understand or do not believe. and it is that trade is mutually beneficial. We talked about this a little bit before, but we need to repeat it. The important ideas in economics you have to be exposed to over and over and over. One of my favorite economists today is a guy named Don Boudreaux. He's from Louisiana. He's at George Mason University now. Basically what he does is find new and interesting ways to remind people of the basic ideas. Okay? Because to be, and he emphasizes this, to be a good economist doesn't mean that you spend all of your time dealing with complicated graphs and complicated math. So that to be a good economist, you need to have a very, very good understanding of the basic ideas, the basic principles of economics. And I agree with him completely on that. Authors of your textbook agree with him completely. They also are at George Mason. I'll be referring to George Mason University a lot because they have an incredible group of economists there. And their focus is largely on, it's kind of different from most economists these days. Their focus is on how can we effectively communicate the important ideas in economics to people who are not economists, people who may never, ever be in an economics course. Right? They want the average citizen to understand economic principles so that the average citizen will be able to listen to the promises made by politicians and tell who is saying things that make sense. And after you get through this course, you'll be able to listen to politicians and assess how much of what they said makes sense. And I warn you, there's a good chance you may conclude much of what most of them say does not make economic sense if you think through it carefully. And that is one of the goals of this course, to teach you, to give you an incentive to think carefully about economic issues. We said that trade is mutually beneficial. Trade is a positive sum game. Okay? That means that it's not a zero-sum game. What is a zero-sum game? What does that mean? In a zero-sum game, the total doesn't increase. In an athletic event we talked about before is a zero-sum game. You have somebody who wins, but that requires somebody to lose. A war is a zero-sum game. You can't have everybody winning because things get destroyed. People are killed, property is destroyed. War athletic events are actually they're negative sum games. Do you have a question?
What normally happens to the economy during the war?
I'll just touch on that. Okay? We will come back to that later. People often think that, the question was, what happens to the economy during a war? And it's a common thing that people think about. People often say, well, war is good for the economy. Okay? That's a very dangerous statement. What is the economy? The economy is not this thing out there that we're trying to help. Okay? If you're really going to think about what an economy is, the economy is just the collection of people, all of them trying to use the resources they have to produce the things that they want. Okay?
So is America being self-sufficient, or attempting to be, because we're at war with another?
Well, if we're at war, then that one of the effects is that reduces our ability to trade with other countries.
Like coronavirus, we couldn't get masks overseas, and while we had to start making them over here.
Well, anything that limits our ability to trade is going to have a negative effect on us. And obviously, we didn't choose to have the coronavirus, but one of the consequences is that it makes trade more difficult, so it does hurt us. But going back to your question, when people say that war is good for the economy, what they generally mean is that when we go into a war, GDP often goes up. Okay? Well, to deal with that, we have to ask, well, what does GDP represent? And we won't get to that until chapter 26. Okay, so I'm gonna defer answering that question fully. It's a good question, but we're not ready to deal with it fully. All I will say is war good for the people in the economy? And clearly the answer is no. War is a negative sum game. That's why we should try to avoid wars whenever we can. Are there some wars that you cannot avoid? Well, I think that's obviously true. If you have somebody who is bent on, Hitler bent on taking over the world, then probably a war is something you have to go through. But to say that war is good for the economy is very, very misleading. It's not good for the country, but there are things that that are bad for the country, but actually do increase GDP. We'll see when you have a natural disaster. Okay? Is it good to have a hurricane? Obviously not. But when we get to chapter 26, we will see that it is possible for GDP to go up after we have a natural disaster. Doesn't happen always, but it can. And we absolutely should not draw the conclusion that, well, I guess that means a hurricane is good for us. No, your intuition is right. Hurricanes are not good for us, even though it is possible that sometimes they will cause GDP to go up. But we'll come back to that more later. It is so important to keep reminding yourself that trade exchange is not a zero-sum game. It is a positive-sum game, which means when two parties get together and agree to trade, both benefit from it, unless there is some kind of fraud, unless someone is being deceived. And what we're going to see in this chapter is that in many ways, trade almost seems magical, because it's not, but it seems that way, because value is created by trade even when no new goods are created. I like an example that your textbook gives. They talk about the creation of eBay back in the 1990s, and about the guy Pierre Omidyar, who wrote the code for eBay. You might remember that from the book. Well, he wrote the code so that now he could put this on the internet, and he could offer, somebody could put up something to trade, and he's thinking, well, I've got the code. Is this really going to work? Is it going to have any impact? And he had a broken laser pointer. What's a broken laser pointer worth? How could it be worth anything? That would be my thought initially. But he put it up just to see what would happen, offered it for $1. And anybody remember what happened? He was able to, somebody made an offer, he was able to buy it for $15. And he was so surprised that he thought they must be confused. And he called them and said, "Are you sure you understand? It doesn't work. It's broken." And the guy said, "Yeah, I understand. I like to collect laser pointers. It doesn't matter whether they work or not." Very simple situation, but it has profound meaning, because that broken laser pointer does not have a single objective value. we tend to think that things have objective value, that you can look at something, you can look at that box of wipes over there and say, oh, that's worth $3, or we think it has some specific value. A very important idea is that value is subjective. Talking about economic value. Okay? What something is worth is subjective. That means that its value depends on the person, it depends on the place, and it depends on the time. So this pointer, which had absolutely no value to the guy who wrote the code, had a lot of value to the person who put in the bid for it. And so because of this trade, value was created. That nothing new was produced. It didn't produce a new pointer. Okay? Started out, there was one pointer. After this trade, there was one pointer. Okay? But value was created because that pointer went from the hands of somebody who valued it at 0 to the hands of somebody to whom it was worth at least $15. So no new physical good was produced, but $15 of value was created. That's an incredibly important idea. If you can find a way to move goods from somebody who doesn't value them very much into the hands of somebody who values them more, you are creating value. You are creating wealth. That is a pretty simple idea, but it is the basis for everything in a market economy. You prosper by figuring out how can I take something that has a low value and move it into somebody else's hands where they will value it more. Let's say that, another example, let's say that you have an accounting book. You've already taken accounting, not worth anything to you. But you have a friend who is taking accounting this semester, who has to have the book, and it's selling for $250 in the bookstore. You don't have the ability to create a new book, but if somehow you and this other person can get together, make an exchange, then the book that has no value to you goes into the hands of the person who values it at $250, and $250 of value is created. Okay? That is incredibly important. You want to prosper in the market economy, you look for ways to move goods from where they are low value to where they are high value. For quite a while, I believe Sam Walton was the richest person in the world. He wasn't the richest, he was way up there. Right? Created Walmart. What did Walmart create, or what does Walmart create? Hmm? They create some things. They do put some things, or Sam's choice, but most of the things that they produce or that they sell, they didn't produce. Somebody else produced them. And Sam's is just taking those things that some people produced and selling them to somebody who wants them. Sam's or Walmart, they are not, for the most part, creating new physical things. They're just moving things that were somebody else created from one place to another place. And when they do that, that's what Amazon does for the most part. That's what eBay does. And that when they do that, they are acting as middlemen. Middlemen don't produce the goods that they sell. They're simply bringing the buyers and the sellers together. Right? And some people look at middlemen and they think, well, they're not productive. They're just taking advantage of people. Walmart, they're taking coffee that somebody else produced, and then they're slapping a higher price on it, and they're selling it to a consumer. Okay? And that is true, Walmart doesn't produce the coffee that I buy from them. And I could probably get coffee more cheaply if I flew to Colombia and purchased it right there. Okay? But all things considered, if I have to fly to Colombia to get the coffee, that's going to be very expensive for me. Okay? The price I pay for the coffee will be lower, but the cost to me of getting it will be dramatically higher. Okay? When I go to Walmart and buy my coffee, I'm paying them for a service. I'm paying them for finding the things that I want, putting them in a central location where it's easy for me to get to them. Walmart isn't creating new products for the most part, but they are providing a service, and that service is very, very valuable. Right? That's why you look at Walmart, you look at Amazon, the shareholders in those companies have made lots and lots of money. Why? Because those companies are providing services that people value very highly. So we've said that trade is a powerful means of creating value. And when you have a trade in a market economy, it's a voluntary transaction, and so you know that both parties are benefiting from it. This shows us one reason why trade is so powerful, because people's preferences vary. One thing is worth the laser pointer is not worth anything to one person, $15 to somebody else. So trade moves things into the hands of the people who value them most. That's one reason that trade is so powerful. But that's not the only reason. Okay? Second reason that trade makes us better off is because it allows us to specialize in producing one or just a few things. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, we'll be talking about more in chapter 3, starts out talking about specialization. How does specialization help? Well, first, when you specialize at producing something, that means you're not trying to produce everything. You're trying to produce one or just a few things. So if you specialize in bread, you produce bread today, you produce bread tomorrow. You do it over and over and over and over. And what happens when you do something over and over and over? You get better at it. Okay? You find better ways to produce the product. You can improve the product, and you can produce at a lower cost. Think about personal experience. Think about the first time you drove a car. It's been a long time, but I remember the first time I drove a car, and I was not very good at it. I was very happy when my first driver's ed lesson was over. I was very happy that I did not run into a ditch, because it took all of my thinking to manipulate the steering wheel and the pedals correctly. Now that I've been driving for decades, I don't get in the car and think, am I going to be able to keep the car on the road? It's second nature, because I've done it over and over and over and over. The more you do something, the better you become at doing it. And your book refers to this as the division of knowledge. Division of knowledge. Some books refer to it as the division of labor. But I think division of knowledge is really a better term for it, because when you specialize in something, somebody who owns a pizza place, they specialize, they produce pizza, they get better and better and better at it. Every day, the knowledge in their head about how to make pizza is growing. They are adding to their stock of knowledge about how to produce that product. And you have a doctor who's treating patients. And let's say he's a bone specialist. So every day he's treating people with bone problems, bone issues. And so every day his stock of knowledge about providing that service grows. And as we are all specializing in different things, that means the stock of knowledge in each person's head is getting bigger and bigger. When we trade, we all get to benefit from all of that knowledge. There's nobody who has all of that knowledge because each person is specializing. The knowledge in the surgeon's head is different from the knowledge in the pizza owner's head. But as they're all specializing, their knowledge is getting bigger and bigger. And the key thing to see here is that when we trade, we all get to benefit from all of that knowledge. Compare it to, what if you had a society where the only thing they produced was wheat? Everybody's a wheat producer. Then every day, each person, because they're specializing, they're becoming better and better at producing wheat. Okay? But producer one, his knowledge is going up. Producer two, his knowledge is going up. But they're finding better ways of doing the same thing. So their collective knowledge, maybe you got 1 million people producing wheat. Their collective knowledge is not going to be a whole lot greater than the knowledge in one person's head because they're all doing the same thing. But if you have a society where you've got 1 million people, they're all specializing in different things, then the total knowledge they have is going to be a huge multiple of what's in any single person's head. So this specialization makes it possible to have collective intelligence that far exceeds the intelligence that any single person has. Think about a market economy. You've got people who are specialized in music, people specialized in neurosurgery, pizzas, teaching, engineering. We've got all this specialization going on. All this knowledge is increasing, and we all get to benefit from all of that knowledge. Questions so far? A second thing happens when we specialize and trade. Okay? First is that we have this division of knowledge and the total knowledge grows. Second is when you specialize, you produce a far larger quantity than if you were producing just for yourself. Let's say you live in a society where there's no specialization and no trade, and you want bread for your family. So you spend part of every day producing bread. Well, what if there is a machine or an oven you could use that if you used it, you could dramatically lower the per unit cost of a loaf of bread. You'd like that, but to do that, you would have to produce 1,000 loaves of bread a day. Okay? Would you do it? If you can't trade, you'd say, well, yeah, I'd like to lower the cost per loaf, but I don't need 1,000 loaves of bread. That wouldn't make any sense. But if you have special opportunity to specialize in trade, then if you find out about this machine, this oven, that would be more efficient, then you can say, I'm going to specialize in producing bread, and I'm going to buy this oven, and I'm going to spend all day producing bread. And because I'm producing so much, the cost per unit is going to be very low. I can then let other people specialize in other things, and somebody specializing in growing vegetables. Well, I can sell them bread at a low price, and then they can sell me vegetables at a low price. They're going to be, if they're specializing, they're becoming more efficient. Right? And we can all benefit from this specialization in trade, partially because we are able to use these high quantity devices or machines that wouldn't make any sense if we were only producing for our families. But if we can produce on a large scale, then we can adopt these large scale technologies, and the cost of each unit goes down. And if the cost goes down, then the price to the consumer goes down. Okay? I'm going to try to share a video with you. Let's see if it works.
Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus team up. Epic stories. The largest streaming
originated as a small wild jungle bird in
Hold on. This is about chickens.
Southeast Asia.
Well, I'm having trouble getting it onto the screen here. So I guess, hold on.
It's by far the fastest.
Well, it's not going to work. So I'll have to work on that for another time. But I'll tell you about what it is. I'll try to remember to put up a link. It's a 3.5 minute video about chicken. And I did not realize how much the chicken market has changed over the last 3 or 4 decades. The average chicken today weighs 4 times as much as the average chicken did in the 1950s. And in this video, I talked to this producer. He says that they can raise 200,000 chickens at a time. And to produce those 200,000 chickens, they need a computer and 2 people, 2 workers. And they can do that 8 times a year. You know, if you were growing chickens for your family, you would not be using the technology that he is using, because you don't want 200,000 chickens. But because they are specializing, they can use the technology that produces a huge amount, and then they can sell it in a very big market. The end result is that the cost of producing chicken is very, very low. And we'll see later that when the cost of producing something goes down, competition pushes the price down. Okay? The producers are trying to make profit for themselves, but the end result is the price to the consumer gets lower and lower and lower. And the same thing happens not just with chickens, but with computers and with clothing and with everything else. Competition pushes costs down, and that pushes prices down. And that wouldn't happen if you didn't have the ability to specialize and then the ability to trade. So what have we seen here? We've seen that when we have specialization, then that leads to improvements, partially because of the division of knowledge, partially because producers can then turn to large quantity production methods, and that leads to lower costs and lower prices and higher living standards. How far can this specialization go? Going back to Adam Smith, one of the things he is noted for, statements, he said, specialization is limited by the extent of the market. Specialization is limited by the extent of the market, which means how much specialization you can have depends on how big the market is. Imagine you live on an island where it's just you and one other person. Well, you can have some specialization, but you can't have a whole lot because you only have 2 people. You're not going to have anybody specialized in creating computers or in neurosurgery or things like that, because you just don't have enough people to specialize in everything. If you had a society with 10 people, well, then you can have a lot more specialization. If you have 1 million people, you get even more specialization. The bigger the market, the more specialization you can have, which means the more gains from trade you can have. Think about, just as an example, think about restaurants. If you go to a small town, then you're probably only going to find 1 restaurant. And if you only have 1, they're not specialized in any particular kind of food. They're probably going to have hamburgers. They're only going to have things that lots of people like, and they can't produce everything. But if you go to a larger town, larger city, then you're going to find a number of restaurants. And you're going to find some that specialize in Mexican food, some that specialize in Chinese food. You have a lot more specialization, which means consumers have a lot more choices. If you go to Los Angeles, where you got millions of people, then you have an enormous, seems infinite number of restaurants. So they don't just have restaurants that are specialized in Chinese food. They have a lot of restaurants that are specialized in particular kinds of Chinese food. The larger the market, the more specialization you can have, which means consumers get more of what they want, consumers benefit. Why are the producers specializing? Because they have an incentive to do that. Because if they can figure out how to give consumers what they want, then they get more consumers, they get more profit. And a market economy creates incentives for each person to try to figure out, how can I give somebody else what they want? Because you can't, in a market economy, you can't hit somebody over the head and say, you're going to trade with me. To get them to trade with you, you have to make it worth their while. And so you have to figure out, what is it that other people want? One of the things that people really miss, they don't see in a market economy, that in a market economy, it creates an incentive to focus on other people and try to figure out, what do they want? Because if you're a producer and you say, I don't care what other people want, I want to produce this kind of computer and that's what I'm going to produce, then you're not going to sell very many, you're not going to make much profit, you're not going to be very wealthy. But if you can figure out, if you're somebody like Steve Jobs, who can figure out what people would value if they had it, and then you can figure out how to produce it, and then once it's available, you can sell it at a price they're willing to pay, then billions of people benefit from it. They benefit from your thinking carefully about what would people really value. So now the entrepreneur may be motivated by, how do I make profit for myself? He may be greedy. That's always a possibility. But in order to get the profit he wants, he has to understand what consumers want. So one of the important things to be successful is observe people carefully. Figure out, what do they want? What do they like? If you're you're running a restaurant and you haven't figured out that people care how they're treated, and if you treat them rudely, you may have good food, but they're not going to come back. To be successful, you have to notice, what do people like? You have to notice, if I yell at them, they don't like that, they don't come back. If I treat them with respect, they like that, they come back. You have to pay close attention to what people like, what people value, and figure out how you can use your resources to give people what they want. If you do that, you're helping other people, and you're also helping yourself, because you're going to be successful. In a market economy, it's not about beating other people. It's about making exchanges that are mutually beneficial. And that's often hard to do. You know what you want, but you got to figure out, you got to think about, what does the other person want? Market economy gives you an incentive to do that. And this is a really important idea. Think about our trade policy over the last couple of years. Okay? Our president has talked about trade with China as if it's a war. In fact, I think he has called it a war. Okay? And it says they're winning, we're losing. Okay? That's not the way it works. Trade is mutually beneficial. If we cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, that means we are reducing the extent of the market. That means we can't have as much specialization, we can't have as much trade, we are not going to have as much prosperity. I'm not saying that China has not done some things that we could reasonably object to. Okay? but I'm talking about this, the basic idea of trade. Trade is mutually beneficial. And the more trade we can have, the better off we're going to be, the better off the other country is going to be. Okay? All right. Now, that takes us to the third reason that trade is beneficial. And this has to do with what is called comparative advantage. This is where it gets a little tricky. Okay? Think about your abilities, your ability to do various things. Do you think your abilities are exactly the same as the person who is sitting next to you? You have exactly the same abilities that your parents do or your siblings do. No, we vary, sometimes tremendously, in what we are good at doing. You know, I think about people who, musicians and actors and entertainers who are just, I mean, they act in a movie and they do, you know, they provide great entertainment and they just make it look so easy. And I often think, you know, what would it be like if I were in that movie, if I were playing that part? And you know, I think it would probably be just unbelievably hilarious because you know, I can't do that. The abilities that Brad Pitt has to entertain people, I don't have those abilities. And so this third reason that trade is beneficial has to do with the differences between people. And to understand how this works, we need to distinguish between two important concepts. And let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. For those of you who are here, I know part of the screen is cut off. I spent a lot of time trying to get that to work. Our tech people have tried to get it to work. It's a problem with the projector here, so I'll try to make sure that anything that's cut off, I'll read it to you. We need to distinguish between two ideas. One is the idea of absolute advantage. And this is probably the more straightforward idea. Absolute advantage refers to the ability to produce the same good using fewer inputs than another producer. You have an absolute advantage of producing something if you can produce it using fewer inputs than another producer can. And your book talks about Martha Stewart, who was successful in a whole lot of different things, all kinds of things about the home and about dressing, and very, very successful. Magazine, TV show, all kinds of things. And they use the example of ironing. Okay? Because part of what she did is give tips on practical things at home like ironing. And they make the assumption that Martha Stewart is probably very, very good at ironing. She's very good at everything about the home and about clothing. Okay? So let's say she has an assistant who's helping her with things. Her assistant probably is not as good at ironing as she is. So is there any benefit to Martha Stewart to having an assistant? Because she can do the ironing better than the assistant can. But we have to think about the other things that Martha Stewart can do, the other things she's good at. She's good at ironing. She's also very good at running a multi-million-dollar business. She's very good at doing that. And she has limited time. She can't run her business and do the earning at exactly the same time. So when she is doing the earning, she's not running her business. When she's running her business, she's not doing the earning. Her assistant, no doubt, could also run a business, but probably would not do nearly as good a job as Martha Stewart. So the question then is, and this may seem like a silly example, but it's extremely important because the answer has implications for how the United States deals with other countries. Okay? We're looking for the principle here. Okay? The question is, when you have two people where Martha is better at everything than her assistant, is there any basis for trade? Is there any gain from her hiring the assistant? Or should Martha simply say, well, you know, sorry, you're just not good enough at anything, so you know, I don't need you. Okay? And the really important point we're going to see here is that even though Martha is better at everything, she has the absolute advantage in both goods, there is still the potential for gain through specialization and exchange. And we're going to apply this in, we're almost out of time. I'll set up the example we'll be talking about next time. The assumption here is that we are looking at two countries, Mexico and the United States. We're trying to make this simple so that it's as easy as possible to see to draw conclusions. We're assuming that there are only two goods that are being produced, computers and shirts, and we're assuming there's only one resource that's being used, and that one resource is labor. The assumptions here are that in Mexico, in order to produce one computer, it takes 12 units of labor. In Mexico, it takes 2 units of labor to produce one shirt. In the United States, it takes 1 unit of labor to produce a computer, and it takes 1 unit of labor to produce one shirt. Okay? So this information is telling us about the abilities of each country, the workers in each country. Now, in terms of absolute advantage, who has the absolute advantage in producing computers? United States does, because they can produce a computer with only 1 unit of labor, whereas with in Mexico, we're assuming it takes 12 units of labor. So clearly, given our assumptions here, the United States has the absolute advantage in producing computers. What about shirts? Who can produce a shirt with the least amount of resources? Still the United States, because it only takes 1 unit of labor. This is purely hypothetical data. Whereas in here we're saying Mexico, it takes 2 shirts. Okay? So they've set up a situation where the United States has an absolute advantage in producing both goods. Should people in the United States then say, well, you know, we have the absolute advantage in both goods, so we can't benefit from trade? Absolutely not. I'm going to be talking about the law of comparative advantage, which says that if a country has a comparative advantage in producing a certain product, and if each country specializes in what they have a comparative advantage in, and then they trade, everybody benefits. Okay? The country that doesn't have an absolute advantage, they benefit, but the country that's better at producing both things benefits as well. Okay? So next time we'll be talking about, we'll be going through the look for this production possibilities curve in the textbook, That does get a little bit complicated, but it's really important because you're going to see that there's another way that trade really seems magical because it enables us to produce, to consume more than we would otherwise be able to consume. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions.
How can we access the PowerPoint slides?
Send me an email, and I will think about that. I'm not